What's going on, workforce? Brian and Chris here, reporting live from Charlotte today. We're going to talk about the graphics update, the impact on the engine, the overall flow of Final Fantasy XIV as we look at the 10 years. Obviously, like we've all been speculating, will they create a new engine? Will it be like Final Fantasy XIV 2? Or will they continue to build on top of the system and also replace parts that haven't aged well in Final Fantasy XIV? And I think we got our answer from the live letter this weekend. And there's strengths and weaknesses to all of these approaches, so we thought we'd discuss the overall impact, our expectations, and our hopes for the future, especially as it relates to this graphical update in 14. Chris, dude, like obviously we played three truths and a lie, or how, like there were a couple fun things that people seem
varying
to really, varying number of truths and maybe a lie in there or two, and that ended up being a very well received video. I think a lot of people enjoyed the overall flow to it, but graphical update. Yoshi P playing two truths and a lie by like kind of like showing off like an example that wasn't the real example. What are we thinking here about what they communicated for the future with the fact they're updating graphics now?
I think they did a great job handling expectations without getting into the like 30-minute breakdown of like it's not this. Like when they went over like the stat squish and stuff like that, it felt like they had to really drill down, and they did it repeatedly. And so for people that got it, you're like, yes, we know. And then for people who didn't, they're like, why are they talking about this long? But then like you would hear things later like, we're getting weaker. And so, you know, it's like, well, this is why they talked about it so long. And I think they really did a nice job of making it long enough that it answered most of my questions, most of the questions that I kind of saw, but also short enough that it can be something that hopefully there's not as much misinformation, because the truth is hidden in some like much longer explanation than it needed to be.
I don't know, man. I like ultimately and this is just the cynic in me goes, it's like, I know I'm going to see some post talking about how like 14 and they're going to show it to like some kind of like 16 model. Like, this is where we're going, guys. It's like, maybe in another decade. I don't know.
But they showed us like too little, too much. Like they gave us a range at least. Yes, like the misinformation will be out there. There was misinformation articles literally published during the live letter. Like he said, the one thing I can tell you is it's not this, and those were published before the live letter ended. Yeah, saying like, you know what I heard. And so like I went to Google something, and like there were already articles showing up about the live letter during it that I was, are we not watching the same presentation?
It's what's on an aside, just so like everybody knows why that happens, is that it's more important to be first than it is to be right in terms of that level of engagement. So sites will put that up so that the Google out, you know, like it hits in the system, and then they could go back and change it, even, you know, if they're wrong. Yes. And that's the reason why they do that, is because it's more important to be first than right. And maybe one day we'll be in a system where it's not incentive. First isn't incentive, the you know, being right is the incentive, but that's the world we live in right now, and that's not the topic of the video.
So there has been a debate, at least between you and I, about whether or not they were going to build a new Final Fantasy XIV, or they were just going to piecemeal fix this one into being a new Final Fantasy XIV.
Right.
I thought there was too big of a player base and too much money invested to risk people slipping through the cracks by moving to a Destiny 2 type moment.
Yeah. Well, and I wasn't advocating for a Destiny 2 type moment, because legitimately that was, I think, the wrong call. But something where it's like, you're still connected, it's still the same game, but like, you know, a Phantasy Star Online New Genesis moment where it's like you log in, you're like, what era do I want to go to? Right. Because the concept comes down to is digital preservation, right? Like if you want to experience 14, really what I would say now, and this is the good information for me to have from the team, the best way to experience 14 is in the moment, because the graphics overhaul is great, but they're going through and updating systems like the dungeons we talked about on Monday, and changing mechanics, and that's not a bad thing, but
it's a living, breathing game.
It's a living, breathing game, as opposed to like, because at some point, the question that I have in mind is that at some point in another 10 years or another 10 years, like when we're in the 2030s and 2040s and we're still playing this game, because it's just like, we're nerds.
And they call it Final Fantasy because Fantasy 14. They call it Final Fantasy 14 because they didn't ever want to overcome the SEO loss of changing the name.
Right. Or essentially, like, is there a point where then we see a 14 classic where it's like, hey guys, do you want to go back and experience 14 prior to these things? We've spun up this one environment. Or do we see fans do the very thing that Square Enix doesn't do? And that's what we see with 11 classic versus 11 retail. Like, there is this concept of like a point in time that people would like to experience. And so with the fact that 14 is going in this direction, I was definitely wrong in terms of that, them having kind of a bigger cutover to 14.2 or something like that, where you are connected and this ends up being a new saga, a new entry point for players. But beyond that, the question then is that, that still introduces some of the challenges within terms of the structure of the game. Like, will they have to play, all the way through Endwalker just to get into 7.0 in 2 years or 2.5? Because and then 8.0, like, if that's a constant, kicking that can down the river, like my whole drumbeat on every video that I talk about 14 is like, you should start now, you'll thank me later, you should start today, you should be in the free trial. Like, nobody should start outside of Stormblood in 2020 2025. It's like, come on, like, get in. You're going to have at least that level of investment so that when it comes down to it, you're not like, oh gosh, how many hours? 2,000 hours so I can complete, like that's the question that I have with it. But the fact they're willing to go in and update these systems from a software engineering perspective, like, that requires a lot of discipline, a lot of work, and ultimately it benefits the game. But if you were sitting here saying, is it easier to build new or is it easier to replace an existing system? It's way easier to build new. But now we already know that what Yoshi P said about the friends list getting an update. I think that's going to be actually a real impactful system change, because if anybody who's ever had like filled up their blacklist, because before we could actually report gold sellers, the answer was just blacklist them. And I was like, I've already filled them up with 200, and it's so hard to go and try to clean that up that it's not even worth it anymore. So seeing that system get an upgrade, I think it's going to be massively huge. Seeing what they're talking about in terms of like bringing some of that Boja into the open world system, I think that's going to have a very big impact. And overall, if they can do it to the core aspect of the game, eventually you're not going to recognize what 14 is today or what it was a couple years ago, because it has been, replaced, restructured, rebuilt, and it's that living game that. The question is at what point do we see somebody create a classic, a classic version of it, so people can experience 14 what it was prior to the 2020s?
The new player experience has gotten way better.
Mm-hmm.
The graphics are going to improve.
Yep.
They're willing to go back and revisit old dungeons. The
Yeah.
trusts are coming backward,
Mm-hmm.
which we both thought would take years, and they're like, no, in 2 years we can have them all done. How?
I think that's where they said they've improved. Like in Endwalker, they improved the dungeon, the trust system, that it made it easier to go back and do this. So they've continued to invest in that technology. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, but improved seems like a low way of saying it. It seems like it's drastically different in that, like, they went from 4 years ago telling us there's just no way we could ever do that to here's the pace at which we're going to do it. Like, that's a huge amount of ground to cover.
Same thing about the graphics. Like, you go listen to Yoshi P and he's like, I have nightmares of that just like putting it in to change these assets, like the impact that you have to go through and do, and the amount of work. People are like, oh, just update the texture. This one programmer did that over here. It's like, yeah, that's a whole different level of like, okay,
I built only Gridania, and it only has to run for me, and there's no authentication, and there's no other players, and there will never be an update to the client, and like,
right,
yes, I did my one thing. Why can't you guys do it? Well, not quite the same. But like, and some of it's got to be money. Some of it's got to be that the game has grown 10 million players in the last 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, not all those people have stuck around long term, but all those people came in and put some amount of money on the table. And so some of it's got to be that he has more support now than when he's made previous statements.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it's got to be that they're looking out now, and maybe they were discussing at some point we'll sunset Final Fantasy into a Final Fantasy 14-2. Like, maybe. But like, here's where they're at. I was having breakfast with a friend, and he said, I do wonder if Endwalker was not done, like the ink hadn't dried, and the finale to Endwalker was different because of the success of Shadowbringers. That they were ready to sunset the game and move into the next era. Not because they weren't proud of it, because they were like, well, it's only going to hurt us so much.
Mhm.
And now they have so many people invested in so much momentum that they're like, okay, like the amount of people involved, the amount of migration that would have to happen, the amount of resources that are available changes our perspective. If the finale to this and the technological moves forward are like, you know, before I wouldn't have considered that, but with all this available, I think that's a good call.
Yeah, I ultimately start to also wonder on that same note is like, at some point, do they drop the number? Yeah, like Yoshi P's, you know, when you go look at his like 10 years of like words, like nothing that's happening is really that shocking. You know, like either he could have gone either, you know, obviously any choice which way, but when he talks about that at some point the number 14 won't make sense, at some point does he just say this is it? This is Final Fantasy, you know, it was 14 and now it's not.
The reason not to is SEO.
Oh, SEO.
The reason is that like all of our YouTube videos, their most predominant tag is FFXIV. And so FFXIV is what this game is known as. And so like you're giving all of that up. You're giving up all of the search traffic tied to every piece of content that's been made around your game, both by you and by thousands of other people.
Right.
And you're making all of that hard to find. So if that is going to happen, I think that's very much the same way like a corporate acquisition happens, where what it is it's Final Fantasy 14 brought to you by Final Fantasy Online.
Yeah.
And then it's slowly like Final Fantasy 14, a Final Fantasy Online experience. And then it just, and they're like, no, we're never getting rid of 14. And then one day they're like, Final Fantasy Online. Yeah. Like, and so that's how those acquisitions, they say like, oh, no, we would never. But what they mean is not now.
Right.
So if he is going to do it, it'll be something that we see in hindsight. We're like, oh, that makes so much sense. He's been baking us into that new name for years.
Right.
Saying, oh yeah, that's just an adjacent name. But we haven't seen anything move towards that says they're starting to seed the SEO of whatever it is that they want to move to.
It's Nintendo's third pillar approach when they introduced the DS, and they're like, we're going to have the Game Boy, we're going to have the DS, and we're going to have the console. And it's like, and then the Game Boy just disappeared. Because it's like, all right, yeah. Oh, because especially because the DS was so popular and it became like such a, like, oh man, this is really a great system. And then ultimately they're like, okay, we're good. Like it introduced that. Yeah, we're gonna keep doing Game Boys. You know, and then it's like, okay, no, and then that went away, and it's no longer a thing, and now we're like, yep, now we're on Switch, and it's all that good stuff. No, so I'm excited to see that the fact that they're updating graphics. I doesn't for me change my relationship with the game because I've always thought 14 was beautiful. Could it be more attractive? Yes, but I still think when I look at the MMO genre as a whole, I think 14 visually just has always been impressive to me. For what it offers, especially like, you know, like I play on a beautiful monitor, the colors are like really great. I'm not gonna like, you know, refuse this graphical update by any means, but it's like, okay, great. All right. People have been asking for it. I'm wondering.
Have you logged in since the live letter? Mm-hmm. So you've logged in since we found out we're getting a graphical update?
Yeah.
Okay. Cause I feel that I noticed more graphical things missing than I did before.
Interesting.
I feel they've put the pee under the bed, and now they've told me the pee is under the mattress, and so now
you're like, oh, I feel
and
it.
Now I feel it. So I did the Valentine's event after the live letter, and like her brooch is like this pixelated texture baked into her shirt, and so like, and there's things about, and it's like, oh, that doesn't hold up to what they showed us they'll be able to do.
So I think for me though, like right? But for me, I still like in the system. I'm like, I don't think graphics make the game. You know, like graphics enhance it. So it's like, oh, they're making the graphics better. Great. The gameplay is still always going to be kind of the key critical aspect, and graphics, you know, are only going to improve my experience with the game, but they aren't going to define it. You know, in that regard. So I'm happy they're doing it. Like, but I hope nobody misunderstands and thinks like, oh, Brian's negative about the graphic update. Oh, by no means. I've seen people's comments, and I see these are the two comments just for context for everybody listening. So you kind of like, as a content creator, I get a lot of feedback on all kinds of opinions, but a big one people have always kind of held up is the graphics. They're like, I don't like how it looks. was like, okay, well, that's a personal choice. And then the second side of it is that when is the combat, going to be upgraded? Somebody said to me today, like, do you think they're really going to be in 2030s and still have a tab targeting system? And it's like, honestly, I don't know, but I think so. I think that would be wild to see them completely change the battle system again. Especially this late in the game and having all the content that would have to be, a part of it. And those are the kind of the two, like, and I think it's, people just kind of putting up their own walls. Like, okay, you tell me when Beastmaster's in, I'm not going to play this game until there's a Beastmaster, and then they add Beastmaster, and you're like, oh, you tell me when Puppet Master gets in, because I ain't playing this. It's like, you're just saying no, but you're saying no in the most, like, barrier way possible. But that's just my thought.
It depends on what people mean by graphics. If they mean art style, that's not changing.
Right.
This is higher fidelity of the exact same art. And so, like, when Final Fantasy and WoW players say, that don't cross over, graphics is commonly the thing, but it's not graphics, it's art style.
Yeah.
They're saying, like, oh, WoW looks worse. The fidelity in WoW is incredible. The view distance, the amount of ground clutter they can do, the effects they can do, the lighting, they have a very high quality of that art style. Now, that art style is very cartoony and has pros and cons to that. It's allowed them to do a lot with a relatively affordable number of assets, but it also has limited the amount of emotion they can show in an NPC's face.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, there's been pros and cons at every turn, and that happens with Final Fantasy. Like, there are pros and cons to this. Being closer to the photorealism end of the art spectrum, one of the downsides is that things tend to age really poorly. Is that there comes a point where we've made such a move forward as an industry that even the worst games that, like, oh, it's such good gameplay that I don't care that it's not the most beautiful game, are still miles ahead. And if you go back and play something like on an N64 or something like that, that's trying to be more photorealistic, it kind of hurts.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to something that leaned into a little more of the cartoony side of things, where there's a charm to it.
Yeah.
Mario holds up. Mario 64 holds up. GoldenEye doesn't. And so that closer into the photorealistic end of the art spectrum is something that they were going to have to address at some point. I didn't think they'd address it this soon to this degree. This is a massive update.
Absolutely. Anyway, guys, that's just the kind of the thoughts we have on it so far. Sound off, let us know your thoughts as well, because there's a lot to talk about this week and obviously into the future. We're going to have another live letter on March the 4th. That's not that far away. It's like, all right, and that's going to be diving into 6.1 Focus Part 1. So Final Fantasy 14 gearing up for another incredible expansion, another incredible several years as we build up to 7.0. It's going to be good times. Thanks for being here. Chris, why don't you sign us off?
Guys, this is a massive jump forward in the game. I encourage you to take a hard look at what you want to do PC spec wise, because 7.0 will have a minimum spec increase. So for anybody that's already operating on the minimum end, this is kind of your way advanced notice. What do you want to do? Mm-hmm. You've got a long time. They do want to make sure that it maintains a large breadth of hardware, so I think they'll up it as little as possible. But they are definitely looking to up like memory requirements and things like that. So for anybody operating on minimum spec now, this is your PSA at the end of this video.
All right, guys, thanks for being here. We see you in our next one, but until then,
take care.